One unusual opening is the Englund Gambit, E-N-G-L-U-N-D. White will play d4, black sacrifices his pawn on e5 right away. And there's a few traps with this. In this case, we're looking at if black can get away with giving up a pawn for quick development and perhaps win. White's going to take the pawn. Now, usually you can have something like d6 when pawn takes and you get development of the bishop out. But another good possibility is just develop the knight on c6, attacking this pawn on e5. So white's going to develop his knight on f3 to hold the pawn with this. And white could continue his development, for example, something like this. And white could also develop his knight. And white's got a good game in this case. So black instead tries to sacrifice, or at least open up the king side by giving up another pawn. White doesn't take right away. For example, he gets development for black to get the knight out. So what happens is white decides to get his bishop to f4 and hold the pawn that way, because there's now a bishop and knight on it, and black had a knight and pawn attacking. So now it's even with that. At this point, black could try g5, attacking the bishop, and then as the bishop retreats to bishop to g3, white can then try to push the pawn again to g4, making white's knight move, and then black can get that pawn on e5 and equalize. However, another idea with this is just to grab the pawn right away. And now white has two good choices, the knight or the bishop. If the bishop takes, black can just take the bishop with the knight. The knight's going to take, and black develops his knight to f6. Pretty even. So we look at this, and white decides to take it with the knight, taking the pawn on e5. Now what can be played is knight f6 to develop, or bishop to b4 check, in which case if it kicks back and go to bishop d6. But in this case, black goes the queen to f6, putting 2 on this knight. The knight and queen only held by the bishop. So white either moves the knight, let's say back off with this, or push a pawn and hold the bishop and knight. And then if the knight takes the knight, develop the knight to c3, and white continues quick development. But white decides to take the pawn and the knight on c6. Now there's two ways of taking, with the pawn towards the center with this way or this way. Something like this, taking the knight, white can play e3, because if you notice, the queen is threatening that bishop, and then black can play bishop down to b2 with this. White can then play knight to d2 and hold the rook. So black plays the pawn takes pawn from the d to the c square, so he can get this bishop out. So when you see this move with this, white's saying, well, my bishop is hanging. I can either protect it with the e3, I can push the queen to c1, or in this case, white plays bishop c1. And this game was played in Paris in 1968, Ruffman versus Gadalt. At this point, black plays bishop to g4, although he could play bishop f5, white would play e3 and he's okay. So bishop to g4 is a little bit more aggressive with this, but here's where white goes wrong. He thinks he can kick back that bishop and have a good game. What he should have played was something like queen to d2 for escape route, or develop the knight, or get the queen out earlier with this and have a better game. But look what happens after h3. The bishop does not retreat, and it's not a good retreat if he moves it. For example, if he goes after this pawn with the queen and bishop on there, white can play queen to d3, queen f2, the king has to move to d1, and black may be okay, but not a big win yet. So instead, black plays rook to d8 right after going after the queen, taking up this open file. So best for white in this case would have been queen takes rook, queen takes queen, pawn takes bishop to get some counterplay for taking that piece. Black can develop his knight to f6, white can hold the pawn, get the bishop d6 and castle, and has got a good game. So if we look at it again with this and see rook to d8, really what happened is knight to d2, so that black cannot grab that queen, but that leads to more disaster. Black will play bishop to c5. As you notice now, the queen and bishop on there, he has a mating attack. So what can he do? He can try knight to e4, for example, but then there goes the queen after the king takes there and mate. So that's no good. So at this point, white thinks he can hold with f3, but what happens here? Check. King has nowhere to go. There's only one move, pushing the pawn. Queen takes pawn, checkmate. Nice trap in this Englund Gambit.